Analysts
airnya
prefer to
gini, cuman
calculate averages over 2 years.
dia bilang.
Our second group of ratios is critically important to understanding how well a business manages and leverages its assets to generate revenues. I'm going to repeat a really, really important point when analyzing the balance sheet. Some analysts prefer to calculate averages over 2 years rather than using the current year. Although this is academically more accurate, it is rarely done in practice by financial analysts. It's much quicker and easier to use the current year. Another important thing to note is that although we could analyze utilization of all assets, typically most analysts focus on what I call the top 6. First, total assets, then cash, accounts receivable, inventory, property, plant, and equipment, and accounts payable. The last one, of course, being a liability technically rather than an asset. Let's start with the asset turnover and property, plant, and equipment turnover ratios. You'll see that both ratios start with revenues as the numerator. The asset turnover ratio divides revenues by total assets, while the property, plant, and equipment, or PP&E, turnover ratio divides revenues by simply property, plant, and equipment. Because asset turnover ratios are typically greater than 100%, it is convention to quote them as a multiple rather than as a percent. So let's imagine that the asset turnover ratio was 1.27. We would say the ratio is 1.27 times, typically marked by an X, rather than 127%. For these ratios, the larger the better. To make these ratios more understandable, it is often helpful to talk using currency language. So let me give you an example. Let's assume our asset turnover ratio is 1.27 times and our PP&E turnover ratio is 1.52 times. You can interpret this as for every dollar invested in assets, the business gets $1.27 of annual revenue. And for every dollar invested strictly in PP&E, the business gets $1.52 of annual revenue. I'm using the dollar because I'm based in North America, but the same applies if we're talking in pound sterling, the euro, the yen, and so on. For the remaining 4 ratios, you're going to see 2 versions of the ratio, a turnover version and a days version. Let's imagine we calculate a cash turnover ratio of 40 times. This means for every dollar we have in cash, we generate $40 of revenue. Another way to think of this is that our current cash balance turns over 40 times in a year. If you think of it this way, it will help you better understand the cash days ratio. Because if cash turns over 40 times in a year, and a year has 365 days, well, 365 divided by 40 gives us 9.125 days. In other words, our current cash turns over every 9.125 days. Now, another way to think about it is, let's imagine for some reason the business had no revenue for 9.125 days. The company's cash reserves would cover the business. Generally, a low number is better for cash days because this is cash sitting in the bank account, not being used to grow the business. That being said, cash days are also driven by industry factors. So, for example, seasonal businesses need to have larger cash reserves to cover them during their slow or low season. Likewise, tech startup companies typically need large cash reserves to carry them through until revenues really start to grow. We can now calculate the same 2 ratios for accounts receivable that we just calculated for cash. The accounts receivable turnover ratio again has revenues, but this time it's divided by accounts receivable rather than cash. So let's imagine we calculate an accounts receivable turnover ratio of, let's say, 12 times. So in other words, for every dollar in accounts receivable, we're generating $12 of revenue. But you can also read this ratio as accounts receivable turns over 12 times a year. This is a great bridge to the accounts receivable days ratio, because if accounts receivable turns over 12 times a year, well, 365 divided by 12 is just over 30 days. In other words, our customers are taking us approximately 30 days to pay us. Now, generally, the higher the turns or lower the days ratio, the better. All businesses want to get paid by customers as soon as they can. That being said, certain industries and sectors offer different standard credit terms. So, for example, a grocery store or supermarket doesn't let you walk out without paying for your groceries. As a result, we would expect to see low accounts receivable days, whereas another industry may offer standard credit terms of, let's say, 30 days to customers. Now let's look at similar ratios, but this time for inventory. Now recall that one of my big messages when it comes to effective ratio analysis is always compare apples with apples and oranges to oranges. We could use revenue as the numerator of the inventory turnover ratio, and some analysts do this to keep it consistent. However, it's more precise to use cost of goods sold if that's available or disclosed on the income statement. Why, you may ask? Well, cost of goods sold represents what we paid for the inventory and will therefore give us a more accurate sense of how often inventory turns over. Let's imagine that the inventory turnover is 4 times. This means inventory turns over only 4 times a year. If we want to turn that into a days ratio, we take 365, divide it by 4, and we get 91.25 days. Generally, like accounts receivable, higher inventory turnover or lower inventory days is what every business wants. But as I mentioned several times already, different industries will have different expectations in terms of how long they need to hold their inventory. To use my grocery store or supermarket analogy again, you would expect inventory turnover to be high or inventory days to be low for grocery stores because a lot of what a supermarket sells is perishable. Our final turnover and days ratio relates to accounts payable. You can see that we have used cost of goods sold again instead of revenue. Now, some analysts will need to use revenue, especially if cost of goods sold isn't disclosed on the income statement. But it's more precise to use cost of goods sold if it is available, because cost of goods sold represents the price we need to pay our suppliers. If accounts payable turnover is 12 times, we're saying AP, or accounts payable, turns over 12 times. This means account payable days is going to be roughly 30 days, i.e., on average, the business takes 30 days to pay its vendors or suppliers. I'm sure you're starting to get the hang of this. Now let's look at the accounts receivable ratios, the inventory ratios, and the accounts payable ratios combined. And when we talk accounts receivable, inventory, and accounts payable, that's typically the most common definition in financial analysis for working capital. Now, some of you may have heard that a simple definition for working capital is just current assets less current liabilities. However, in financial analysis, we want to be a lot more precise so that we can analyze operational assets and liabilities and make sure we're stripping out things that are financing assets or financing liabilities. So what do I mean by financing liabilities? Well, often in current liabilities, we can have, for example, some interest-bearing debt. Maybe it's a line of credit. And in current assets, we have cash. Recall that when we calculated invested capital, we took interest-bearing current liabilities and non-current liabilities and then deducted cash to get net debt. We need to analyze cash and interest-bearing current liabilities, but we're going to do this when we do our financial leverage analysis. This leaves us with the 3 operational assets or liabilities, which are accounts receivable, inventory, and accounts payable. Working capital is strictly defined in financial analysis as accounts receivable plus inventory and then minus accounts payable. Let's work through an example. where we can show you how to use the days ratios that we've just calculated to calculate something called the working capital funding gap. So let's imagine that our company buys inventory on day 0. Its supplier gives the business 30 days credit. In other words, the business needs to pay the supplier in 30 days. Let's imagine that the inventory then sits on the shelf for another 30 days before it's sold to a customer. And let's also imagine the business gives 30 days credit to its customer, so the customer pays us on day 90. Now, cash went out on day 30 and cash came in on day 90. There was a period between day 30 and 90 of 60 days that we are going to need to fund as a company. This 60-day period between when we have to pay and before we receive payment is referred to as a working capital funding gap. It's probably no surprise to you. Generally, you want to have a small working capital gap. But again, this is often dictated by industry standards. Companies that have a working capital funding gap, of course, can always go to the bank and get a revolving line of credit to fund the gap. Alternatively, the business can try and negotiate more advantageous terms with its customers and suppliers to try and narrow that gap. Now, let's imagine a slightly different scenario. Let's imagine that we did negotiate 45-day terms with our supplier, and we're only going to give our customer 15 days of credit. Here, our working capital funding gap drops from the original 60 days, or roughly 2 months, to only 30 days, or roughly 1 month. Okay, let's look at asset utilization ratios. I'm going to do something slightly differently. I'm only going to work down in column F. And once I've got all of the things in, I'm then going to just Control R the whole thing, just to speed things up even more. I'm also going to link anything I can to this sheet first before I have to go hunt down items on the financial statement sheet. So we know we have revenue. I could take it from almost anywhere, but we'll take it from... And total assets right at the top. We had the total assets when we looked at return on assets. Then I have revenue here. Revenue again. See, revenue is used a lot. I think that's it for revenue. Okay, and then we need to get all those other items from the financial statement. So now let's work our way down. We have PP&E, so most of this will be on the balance sheet except for COGS. So plus, control page up. And we want property, plant, equipment, row 81. Then we have cash, control page up. Whoops, sorry. Let me close that. Oh, my mouse is acting up. There we go. Okay, so let's try that one more time. That's plus, control page up. And we go to cash, 9135. That's cash times 365. We need accounts receivable, control page up. And then accounts receivable times 365. Good. And then we have COGS. We put a minus sign because that's an expense. We have to go right to the top to row 9. And then we have inventory back on the balance sheet. That's row 78. Then we have inventory times 365. COGS right above. We need COGS again and COGS one more time. Then we need accounts payable, which is under current liabilities. There we are, row 89 times 365. Let's copy it across. And then one fell swoop, control R. Our ratios are done. Now there's lots of ratios here. We are going to look at trends and benchmarking near the end of this course. So right now I just want to look at one ratio in particular, and it's the days ratios and how to interpret them. So here we have days ratios for cash, and that's row 82, if you want to follow me. And what we're saying here is that if there was no revenue for this business, how long would the cash balance last and cover expenses? And you can see here it's roughly between 4.9 and 11.6 days. It's not a lot of time. But this is a retailer that sells groceries and other household goods. And so we'd expect this business to have cash coming in every day. And so there will be different benchmarks depending on the industry you're in. Next, we have accounts receivable days. So on average, customers take 4 or 5 days to pay. Now, whenever you see a ratio that low, it really is telling you that this business is a cash business. People pay in cash, and there's a few exceptions which are distorting the number. So maybe there's a few type of customers that do get credit, but the vast majority get no credit. Next, we have how long inventory stays on the shelf. You can see roughly anywhere between about 43 and 59 days. So we know the groceries are going to move really quickly because they're perishable, but there's a lot of household items and maybe clothes that are on the shelf for much longer because this is an average, remember. Next, we have our supplier days, our accounts payable days. This is how long it takes to pay our suppliers, and typically should represent the credit terms that suppliers give the retailer. So here it looks like suppliers are giving retailers about 60 days or 2 months to pay. Now let's look at the three together. So that's accounts receivable days plus inventory days minus accounts payable days to see if we have a funding gap. And you'll see that we have brackets representing negative numbers. Yes, you're saying the right thing. This is called negative working capital. We have no funding gap. In fact, we get our money from our customers before we have to pay our suppliers. So think about it this way. It takes roughly 5 days for customers to pay us, so we have the cash. Things sit on the shelf for around 50 days, but we don't have to pay our vendors until 60 plus days. So this is called negative working capital, and we don't need any funding. And we'd expect this of any retailer that is selling something like groceries, like household items, perishable items, and so on. Okay, now you know the drill. If you want extra practice, join me and go through mid-retailer. But if you're comfortable, skip mid-retailer and go and test yourself with small retailer. See you soon. Okay, let's try it again with mid-retailer, and I'm going to encourage you to see if you can speed it up. We're trying to build our model so there's limited to no error or little chance of an error, and we want to build this as quickly as we can. Recall, first step is always try to link something to the sheet instead of to another sheet so that we can verify that the number is correct. So I'm going to go up to gross margin the first time we introduce revenue, select that. And we also have total assets, which is near the top, and the return on assets ratio, 33024. I'm going to work down rather than across because then I can do Control R, fill right just once. I'm going to link everything that I already have on the sheet, which is primarily revenue. We don't have any of these balance sheet items. So we'll primarily have to go to the balance sheet when we link. Okay, and then we have all those things we don't have here on the sheet. Next, we go slowly and make sure we pick the right number from the financial statement worksheet. So property, plant, equipment, control page up. Let's go slightly higher, and row 81 is our property, plant, and equipment. Control page up, just a bit above that, and row 76 is cash. We're going to go cash times 365. Our accounts receivable is just below cash. Whoops, wrong way. Control page up. That's row 77. Accounts receivable times 365. Now our COGS is at the top of the financial statement sheet, so I'm going to put a negative sign. Control page up. Whoops, sorry. I didn't do control page up. Let me just escape there. Control page up. And we go right to the top. Row 9. Again, make sure it's turned to a positive. Then back to the balance sheet. For inventories, inventory times 365. We have COGS already. We need COGS a couple more times. Let me capture that. COGS and COGS. And then accounts payable is under current liabilities on the balance sheet. Row 89. Times 365. Then we're going to copy it across. Fill right, Control R. And let's just look at the days ratios again. So our first one is row 82. So I'm going to scroll across. Okay. Here, let's compare mid-retailer to big retailer. Recall that big retailer only had about 6 to 11 days of cash. This retailer has a larger chunk of cash set aside, so it can stay afloat if revenues didn't come in for roughly 20 days. It looks, again, like a cash business. Again, that number is never going to be perfectly zero, but the fact that it's so low tells us maybe a few customers get credit, but the vast majority do not. The inventory, although these retailers are similar, looks slightly different because this inventory moves a lot quicker. Instead of 48 to 50 days, we're talking 30 days or a month. And credit terms look similar. It generally pays roughly between 50 and 63 days. And you can see, no surprise therefore, we have the same situation. We have no funding gap. We have something called negative working capital. Okay, now you have a go with small retailer. Bye for now.